112 here on the spot, just dipping below in and out of that level. But there you have the currency rate at a time when the trade talks are still ongoing between the U.S. and Japan, of course. The currency framework is expected to be part of that, although we have no conclusions at this time. Mandy.
Whoa. Thank you very much for that, Nancy. Well, voting, of course, is underway in Indonesia, the world's biggest one-day election. And less than half an hour now before the Indonesian polls open. So let's get once again to our Martin Soong, who's joining us on the ground from Jakarta. What's the buzz on the ground right now, Marty?
Hey, good morning, Mans, and good morning, Nan and Asia. Right now, honestly, not a lot is happening. It's very quiet, although we are about 30 minutes away from polls opening here in Indonesia, including at the one behind me here. We're in central Jakarta. I have to say, this is going to be just a massive, a monster logistical exercise. You made reference to the fact that this is going to be the biggest single-day election on the planet. That is true. 193 million Indonesians eligible to vote here, and most of the attention has been focused on the race for the presidency, which is a rerun of 2014, as we know. Jokowi, the incumbent, versus Prabowo Subianto. The question is the margin of victory. Jokowi is favored to win a second five-year term. The margin of victory, whether he'll have more or rather a stronger mandate to govern and push through some of his reforms, including more infrastructure development. That's been one key factor in this race here, guys. But I have to say, I mean, the numbers seem to be with Jokowi. He's enjoyed a double-digit lead for months now. That's one. 5% growth for the last, well, since he took office, which is not too shabby, although it is well below the 7% that he had promised initially. The infrastructure achievements, when we landed, it was at a brand spanking new airport with no congestion at all. Everything ran smoothly, so it's really night and day, the infrastructure development in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta, since the last time we were here for the 2014 elections. And inflation, which is always very important for the electorate here, they're very inflation or price sensitive here, the lowest in a decade, should certainly help him. Plus, the Joko Widodo government has been very fiscally responsible, very prudent. They're aiming to trim the deficit down to below 3% of GDP, closing in on even 2% there. So a lot going for him, although I have to say one poll says there's still an outside chance, 25%, 1 in 4, of a shock Prabowo victory, guys.
Okay, Marty, just hold that thought. I'm going to bring in our guest now, and we'll get back to you for some more comments at the top of the hour, also when the polls do open, and we'll get a pulse check on how they're starting to track. But Katrina L. is economist at Moody's Analytics, and she joins us here in the Sydney studio. Katrina, thank you so much for joining us. Martin said just a moment ago that with forecasts for GDP for 2019 at around 5.2%, that is less than Jokowi's 7% target. And of course, the challenger, as challengers would always do, is criticising the economic record, saying things like, oh, look, Indonesia's debt has ballooned under Jokowi, etc., etc. Let's just put campaign rhetoric aside, and what is the reality with regards to the economic track record so far for Jokowi?
Well, I think the reaction of financial markets to a potential Jokowi victory in the presidential race is quite telling, because it does show that it is a well-functioning government, and we have, had economic improvements, even though it hasn't quite been at the pace that was expected at the start of his term. And as you mentioned, there has been infrastructure improvements, but it could have been more, and there could have been significant room for improvement. But progress has been made, and I think that's important.
And then how much of the pace is actually out of Jokowi's control?
That's a really good point, and I think that is a large contributing factor, because Indonesia is an incredibly large island, and there's many islands, and so it's a difficult logistical thing to make substantial improvements.
And Katrina, when we talk about economic change that is out of Jokowi's control, one thing that has really worked in his favor, I would imagine, is the stabilization in the currency. And a large part of that is down to the Fed's pivot, you might say, and these easing concerns over current account deficit countries. And coming after what we saw were some 6 rate hikes from Bank Indonesia. I mean, what are you expecting this year, and how is this going to play into the whole consumer outlook?
So we're expecting that Bank Indonesia will keep the policy rate steady, at least through the first half of this year. And that's really important, because Bank Indonesia has made it clear that they're acutely concerned about external stability, and there's still the risk that, with a heightened global uncertainty and heightened geopolitical risks, that emerging markets could again fall out of favour as they did last year. So we're expecting that Bank Indonesia will keep policy rates steady.
And considering what did happen in the way of the concerns towards the end of last year, I mean, how do you think overall Indonesians going to the polls are feeling about Jokowi's economic record?
I mean, I think that they would be happy with it, but I mean, as most people do, they always focus on the room for improvement, and that's what, a lot of people are really concerned about, how he hasn't quite lived up to the promises that he made. For example, the 7% GDP growth that he made when he first entered office back in 2014, and the way that infrastructure improvements have occurred, but not to the extent that he expected them to.
So on the issue of the infrastructure drive by Jokowi, Martin was telling us a moment ago about how Chinese investment in infrastructure has become somewhat of a flashpoint, a battleground in this political campaign, and Prabowo Subianto, perhaps has been criticising foreign investment in the country and wants a better deal from Chinese investors. Going forward, though, how key and important is Chinese investment in infrastructure in Indonesia to make it happen? And would you expect more or less Chinese investment in the future?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, and that's an issue we've seen throughout Southeast Asia with this One Belt, One Road initiative, in that, there's a real need for improvements in infrastructure throughout Southeast Asia, particularly places like Indonesia, but there has been a bit of a tide shifting away from wanting foreign investment, particularly from the mainland, to fund that infrastructure.
My last question is about... Oh, sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was just going to ask simply about if you're seeking foreign investment elsewhere, Katrina. I mean, there has been an issue, too, here as to what extent foreign investment confidence has improved. We know that's been a big part of Jokowi's push. Overall, though, Indonesia has improved in these rankings, but they're still 73 on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. So would that be a major priority in the next administration?
It is hoped that Indonesia will continue to climb the ranks in things like ease of doing business and other important areas like easing corruption and that sort of thing, because without a more stable and a more conducive business environment, Indonesia's economy will continue to fall short of its potential.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Katrina. Thank you. Katrina L. is economist at Moody's Analytics, and we'll get back to Martin Sung on the ground in Jakarta very shortly, as it's only about 20 minutes away from the opening of the polls in today's election. Coming up, Japanese telcos in focus after concerns that a price war could dampen profits ease. We'll check in on the long-term prospects for the country's telco players next.
I think it is very important for sustainability and profitability to go hand in hand, because we want to pursue sustainability and include that as an agenda for our own growth. Education becomes even more important.
I know that education it is not for profit, but I have got great aspiration to make Sunway University the Harvard of the East. And I always tell the university that we are language, I want to work with the best, and I want to learn from the best.
Within Sunway, of course, we have developed from wasteland to wonderland.
We pride ourselves to be very sustainable community builders. We build things and we are there to stay, and we manage. This is what I want to return back to society. I want to put in the foundation, structure the thing in a proper manner and in perpetuity.
Sunway Group Malaysia, advancing sustainable development in Asia.
Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning. Your favorite.
Thank you. Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning. Look what I made for you.
Thank you. Mrs. Wong? Help! Help!
Good thing your grandson was around when you had your fall, Mrs. Wong.
John Fallon.
Snap out of it.
The one and only Cher.
Me and I could just have the best time.
With lip-sync karaoke and a performance from the Cher Show. Plus Pete Buttigieg.
I'm the avocado toast of the Democratic Party.